What are they booing about? Well, I don't know. Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks, where using your mind is not necessarily a bad thing. And where being cranky can actually be mindful. Let's crank it up. Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks. We're very happy today to be talking to Barry Magid, who is a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst in private practice, New York City, and also the head Zen teacher, I believe, of the Ordinary Mind School Sangha in New York City, and the author of a recent book, which we'll be talking quite a bit about today, called What's Wrong with Mindfulness, and in small parentheses, What Isn't? As well as, if we have time, we'll be talking a little bit about Barry's previous book, Ending the Pursuit of Happiness. So welcome, Barry.
Thank you.
So we thought we'd start just by maybe asking you to tell us something about yourself in terms of how did you gravitate both probably into psychoanalysis and into Zen Buddhism. I think that would be an interesting story just to get a little sense of your journey there.
Well, I came to New York City in 1975 after graduating from medical school. Came here for my psychiatry residency. And somehow I started both studying and going into psychoanalysis as a patient. At the same time, I was doing my psychiatry training, and at the same time, I started going over to Eido Roshi's Zen Studies Society. I went to my analyst 3 times a week, and see Eido Roshi 3 times a week. And from the beginning, I got them all mixed up.
Yeah.
I was very interested in this question of how you have these two disciplines of transformation. Could they be in dialogue with each other? And what does one say about how the other works? What are the assumptions that each carries about what's necessary for change? And certainly, when I was in my psychoanalytic training, I first studied with people who were in the lineage of Karen Horney. And you remember she and Eric Fromm and Richard DiMartino famously had these dialogues with D.T. Suzuki.
Suzuki, yes.
Down in Mexico.
Down in Mexico. And Suzuki was at Columbia for a while some of my teachers were there and knew him. But their interest was basically to use Zen as a lever to pry open classical analysis. They wanted to show that some of the things that Freud thought were necessary for change or for understanding character must not really be so true if you could have radical transformation in another system that didn't share any of those assumptions. Mm-hmm. So for Horney and Fromm, it was how do we open this up in what we're doing as psychoanalysts from as a result of this kind of cross-cultural, cross-discipline dialogue. And I think that was my beginning interest too. My analyst at the time, David Shainberg, was very involved with Krishnamurti. And he did a whole bunch of dialogue groups and videos with Krishnamurti and physicist David Bohm.
Yeah, so, I think I remember that. Yeah,
I got to go to some of those and meet those folks and get an introduction to that way of thinking as well. So that was the beginning of my experience while I was still in training back in the 70s, early 80s.
And then you went on to study with Joko Beck?
Joko Beck. After all the scandals hit the New York Zen Study Society, I first spent some years training with Bernie Glassman, and I did koan study with him. Bernie, though, then pivoted to being focused on work practice.
Right.
And moved up the Yonkers to start a bakery.
Yeah.
And, Bernie was a very enthusiastic and charismatic fellow, and he really just wanted everybody to follow him up there and do that. And his idea, if I was a serious Zen student, I'd stop being a psychiatrist. I'd go up there and be a baker. For some reason, that didn't strike me as a very sensible move. So I didn't do that, but instead I was lucky that some friends who had been out in L.A. with Bernie and Joko talked Joko into coming to New York to lead a session. I think there was tickets to the U.S. Tennis Open were a very significant part of this turn in American Zen history. That's how we bribed her to come out.
Yeah, very interesting.
I'm a big tennis fan.
She ended up working at
there. Yeah.
She ended up working in San Diego.
Ended up at her center in San Diego, and I started going out there. Did that for about 10 years until I got Dharma Transmission from her, and then set up my own shop in New York City.
How long has that been going on, your Zendo there?
Well, I think she got me to start the place in 96.
Oh.
So, wow.
Yeah.
So we just did our 20th anniversary session.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Fall.
Well, that's a great story and how you've evolved. And maybe we'll turn our attention to talking a little bit about your latest book. But I'd like to read a blurb on the back cover, a little introduction, if you don't mind. I think it'll gives a good introduction. It says, mindfulness is in fashion. Oprah loves it. Google teaches it to employees. It has become widespread as a cure-all for stress, health problems, and psychological difficulties, interpersonal trouble, and existential anxiety. But in the context of the Zen Buddhist tradition, what more might mindfulness have to offer? I think that's a provocative way to start. And so what led you to write this book? I mean, let's just hear a little bit about that, and we'll kind of get into the guts of it.
There was a complicated backstory of someone asking me to write something about mindfulness. That's a little hard to go into, but I would say that I did want to do a project with my Dharma heir, Mark Poirier, and the work that we co-authored there is sadly the only written record of his teaching. He passed away a year ago, August, really right after we completed all this. But I was really delighted to be able to do that with him. He was a brilliant, big-hearted, humorous man who somehow had the mission in life of bringing the Dharma to lawyers.
Oh.
He taught law at with Seton Hall Law, and he was involved in contemplative legal groups and taught in college campuses, and this sort of was an outgrowth of his response to what those people thought meditation was and what they thought they were there to learn. And So we were interested in sort of critiquing the whole instrumentalized and commodified approach to meditation that had become known as mindfulness. We thought that there was a whole side of meditation practice that mindfulness obscured and kept people from even getting a glimpse of, because it was so goal-directed, right. So much a means to an end. And when I talk to people about what's wrong with mindfulness, basically I say it's exactly the same thing that's right with mindfulness, that all the things that people cite as the benefits of doing mindfulness practice, whether it's stress reduction or that whole other list of things that was in the blurb, it's precisely that this practice has become a means to an end. That is the problem.
Yeah.
And the success in doing those things makes people not even realize there's a whole other way to approach or understand what meditation, and particularly Zen meditation, is all about, which for us is precisely getting off the treadmill of means to end thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it's really the chapter that we're talking about here is chapter 3, the 3 shaky pillars of Western Buddhism. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what these. My first exposure was Philip Kaplow's book, The 3 Pillars of Zen. As
That's
many
right.
of us read, and so say a little bit about what you.
We were playing off that title, obviously, and I believe what we were referring to were the trends of deracination, secularization, and instrumentalization.
Mm-hmm.
And basically that talks about how Western Buddhist teachers, particularly the ones who brought mindfulness or extracted mindfulness from a kind of Theravada Buddhist practice, deliberately cut it off from its Asian religious, cultural, and ethical roots, psychologized it, turned it into a technique, secularized it, made it something that is the practice of purely of lay people, not run by in a religious setting at all, and began to talk about what it was good for.
Right.
And this has turned out to be enormously influential and popular and successful, and yet, as I say, it tends to cut off meditation from what I think is its true nature, or what's most important about it as a religious practice. And even though I am a lay teacher, because I teach in a Zen center, I'm not a priest running a temple, and I'm not a monk in a monastery. Even as a lay teacher, I always emphasize that Zen is a religious practice. And by that, I particularly mean it is about a perspective on life and moment-to-moment experience that is basically infused with awe or wonder and the perfection or completeness of life as it is. It's not about problem solving. It's not about fixing anything. Mm-hmm. It's about being in this moment and being able to stay there. I could digress a little bit and to say that when we look at the stories that come down to us about Shakyamuni and how he spent all these years doing terribly austere physical and mental practices prior to its enlightenment. You know, he practically killed himself to try to escape suffering. He finally sits down under this tree, and as morning comes, he sees a star. And in one version of that, he looks up and he says, "Oh, that's me." And the way I understood that story was not in terms of some kind of moment of great transcendental oneness where I am now one with the star and the whole universe, and all that sort of stuff. I don't find that very useful. What I found, what I really related to, was he looked at that star twinkling there and he said, "Oh, that star is perfect just as it is. That star did not have to practice in order to become perfect."
Yeah.
That star, just as it is constantly just itself. Nothing is lacking. And that after all this time, I realize I'm just the same thing. And that star, as it twinkles, is constantly changing. It's not perfect because it's arrived at one perfect, unchanging higher state. Mm-hmm. And that's not what I'm about either. I'm in the midst of change and flux, and that is not different, not separable from the perfection of the moment. And that I have, in some sense, gone in exactly the opposite direction all this time, trying to fix myself, to do something to transform my basic nature that, in fact, didn't need transformation at all.
Right, and I think you bring that up in the chapter, too, very clearly. You differentiate between the secular mindfulness approach as being a for-gain approach versus Zen, where it's no-gain approach. I think that's right. That's kind of fundamentally, I think, the core of where these two paths diverge.
Yes, exactly. And I like to quote a 20th century Soto Zen teacher, Kodo Sawaki, who used to insist, Zazen is useless.
Oh, yes.
Right?
Right. And that goes really in the face of this whole instrumentalized approach to mindfulness. And
it's where it dovetails with my practice as a psychoanalyst, because in the old days when people would ask me, what's the difference between psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, I would say, well, psychoanalysis doesn't help anybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that psychotherapy is, by one set of definitions, a kind of problem-solving or symptom-relieving process. And you can sort of go to all sorts of lengths to do research to see and do outcome studies and see is it relieving symptoms the way you want, and is it efficient, and is it cost effective?
Right.
And analysis is just the opposite. It's inefficient and not cost effective and not goal oriented, and it's just as useless in a sense as Zen is. It's not the closest thing in the West we have to something as useless as Zen.
So in a way, are you making a distinction then between psychoanalysis and psychotherapy?
That's right. Psychoanalysis is to psychotherapy as Zen is to mindfulness.
Okay. And are you somewhat picking up on Freud's notion? I've looked at your book, Ordinary Mind, and in the sense that Freud said, well, we want to end up being ordinary. We want to be able to work into love, right? Maybe there's a parallel there.
Well, Freud wanted us to, in some sense,
be ordinary in that sense.
The ordinariness of our minds, but we find our minds extraordinarily frightening and alien to ourselves. That was sort of the notion of the unconscious, that there are aspects of ourselves that we see as not me, that we can't reconcile ourselves to. And for Freud, and in that day and age, it was primarily a world of fantasy and sexuality that was in some way unacceptable to our conscious mind or our image of ourselves. And those fantasies and feelings tended to be split off, repressed, or driven into symptoms. Mm-hmm. Basically, he wanted us to be able to look in the mirror and say, that's me, with whatever appears. That's the basic notion of free association, to really just say anything that comes into your mind. The method of psychoanalysis was to notice you can't do it. That you're constantly trying to control what your mind is doing. You're constantly censoring yourself. You're constantly trying to make an impression on the other person. And you won't let your mind flow freely. And you don't even really know what that is. And it would be sort of a criteria of termination and analysis that you can finally get around to doing that.
Well, I think that that distinction, the distinction between psychotherapy and psychoanalysis is a very interesting one, because I think contemporary mindfulness has sort of planted itself within this therapeutic paradigm. That's why we also see all these efficacy studies of mindfulness out there. And really what they're trying to do is measure whether it had an effect on some sort of symptom reduction. So I think that goes back to what you were saying, is that this instrumentalized approach, this goal-oriented approach, somehow it's as you said, it's obscuring the vastness and richness of the Buddhist tradition, in the sense that my reading is like, okay, mindfulness is very popular, and let's declare victory. We have now transmitted Buddhism to the West.
I think it's very successful, but it really has nothing to do with Buddhism. To me, it's analogous to saying we've discovered that listening to Bach for 20 minutes every day will lower your blood pressure.
Right.
That's a good analogy. Right. That's the purpose of Bach. Right.
You can get lots of people to listen to Bach that way.
Yeah.
Right? And maybe their blood pressure will go down. Are you creating music lovers?
Yeah.
And I think one of our pet peeves, David and I are always a little bit perturbed about when contemporary mindfulness teachers profess then claim that they're teaching the universal Dharma.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a bit confusing and a bit disingenuous in many ways, too.
Yes. The Buddhism is not traditionally an ameliorative discipline. It's not trying to make you happier in your life. It's not trying to make you healthier and more successful. It is traditionally a process of radical home leaving and disengagement, and a complete transvaluation of your normal notion of who you are and what life is all about. It in a certain sense upends traditional pictures of human flourishing. That the original Buddhist life of the as we understand it and embodied in the Vinaya is that we're going to live a life that expresses the reality of impermanence and interdependency. The way we do that is to have no possessions, no fixed abodes, no personal attachments, be totally dependent on, as a mendicant, on alms for our day-to-day existence, save up nothing, have no security. It's basically a philosophy and a life that could be summed up as when you ain't got nothing, you got nothing to lose.
Nothing to lose. That's job.
Yeah, I think you bring that up in the chapter that...
this is not what the mindfulness movement is selling to people. It's
not at all
what anybody thinks they're getting, and it's doesn't have much to do with Buddhism in a traditional sense. It also, of course, cuts it off from any ethical considerations.
Yeah, I think that use the word selling. I think that in itself becomes problematic when you have a need to sell something. You've already entered the marketplace with all the logic of the marketplace. The need for branding, the need for selling, the need for promotion, the need to say if you do X, that Y will occur. Immediately once you've put it into that context, and I think you bring this point up, is that meditation it cannot be separated from the forms of life and ethical context which it's embedded.
That's right. I think it doesn't have to be embedded in a...
doesn't have to be embedded in a classic Asian monastic context.
Monastic, but it is in some way trying to give you a way to step outside that world of getting and spending.
Right.
As if those things are the key to happiness.
I think that's part of the issue that many of us struggle with. In other words, we don't. You're not proposing that we all revert to a monastic life. So then the question is, how do we live in this in these times? Where do we get the ethics and what do we do?
Monastic life was originally, again, supposed to bring home these basic truths of impermanence and emptiness and interconnection. I always thought it was somewhat ironic that people go off to monasteries where the rituals and forms of life haven't changed in hundreds and hundreds of years in order to study impermanence.
Yeah, that's a good one.
But if we understand that impermanence or emptiness, which is another word for the same thing, emptiness means empty of any fixed permanent nature. That's a quality of everything, everywhere already. Right? We're not trying to achieve emptiness or impermanence. It's happening all around you, right? Mm-hmm. So the essence of lay practice is to stay open to the reality of impermanence and interdependence in everyday life. And it's there to teach you that all the time if you orient yourself towards it.
And you, okay, go ahead.
I'm just wondering, have you encountered people that call themselves secular Buddhists, which it might be an oxymoron, I don't know, but they would propose that they can still be Buddhists and be goal oriented. I mean, maybe I'm not fairly characterizing them, but
I think it's a kind of Stephen Batchelor position, or where you're trying to, in some sense, say that you're going to take again a meditation technique or perspective out of a religious package or a cultural package and make it contemporary. I think the problem is that secular too quickly becomes synonymous with instrumental. And that religious doesn't have to mean things like I'm gonna believe in reincarnation, right? That's I'm not a religious Zen Buddhist because I hold to any old Asian cultural ideas like that. That has nothing to do with the central teachings of Buddhism, and I don't need reincarnation to ground ethics. Secular Buddhism is, I think, in fact, an oxymoron, but it is an attempt to say, how do you practice in the midst of lay life? You see, I think that lay is different than secular in that regard.
Yeah, and you're involved in that. What is it? The Western Zen Lay Teachers Association.
It's the Lay Zen Teachers Association. Yes, that was founded some years ago to try to give representation to teachers like me who are teaching outside of residential settings, and to demonstrate something about how the role of teacher is separate from the role of priest. There was a big problem in American Soto Zen Buddhism, particularly in the lineage of the San Francisco Zen.
Yes.
That in order to become a teacher, you had to go through priest training and become ordained. And they would not allow anybody to become a teacher who wasn't doing that. And this was very different than what was going on in other lineages, like the whole White Plum lineage and, Glassman's folks like that. Glassman has very explicitly said he thinks that they're two very different tracks of teacher and priest. And, priest is somebody who runs a temple and does services morning and night. And in Japan, it's somebody who's basically in the funeral business.
Right.
It's really become quite meaningless for most American Zen communities to feel like the person doing the teaching has to be also ordained as a priest. We're not. I'm not sure that it really matters who approaches the altar and lights the incense. Whether this person has to actually be a priest to do these liturgical functions. So this whole organization, anyway, grew out of the reality that most people who are practicing now are practicing in the midst of their everyday life, not in a residential community. And in its mission statement, we said, we believe that the Dharma can be fully realized, expressed, and transmitted in the midst of lay life. And that's a fairly radical notion.
Well, Vimalakirti would agree with you.
Yes, I'm glad to have...
I'd like to come back. You bring up what you call the workshop approach to mindfulness and meditation. And I think that's an interesting way of putting it, because we do see it presented and sold that way. You take a 4-week course, you take an 8-week course, and you're off and running. But one of the points you make in the book is that in the workshop approach, it attenuates any kind of connection to tradition. And it also has the assumption that you can extract mindfulness, and it doesn't have to be something that's inseparable from the way you live and in forms of life and so forth. If you don't mind, I'd like to read a really quick passage here, which I think is very important. You say, one can see the legitimate need for avoiding anything that appears to be proselytizing of a particular religious faith within corporate or educational settings. but it is also part of the secular market-based pitch that mindfulness is a technique that can be separated from any long-term commitments, lifestyle changes, or ethical concerns. There is something wrong when teachers of mindfulness and meditation who are informed by Buddhist practice feel that they cannot share that with those they are teaching. Their teaching becomes narrow and subtly imbued with shame or fear. I think that was a very interesting observation.
I think that was Mark's observation in working with people in all these different university and corporate settings. What are you allowed to teach and say, and how do you narrow down what you teach in order to simply be this non-sectarian, not offensive technique of relaxation or stress reduction that is going to be unobjectable, right?
Right. And I think that
I don't have any experience myself in, trying to teach meditation at Google or something like that. I think there'll always the concern is that you're going to create a new opiate for the masses. Something to create more efficient but also more docile workers.
Yeah, that's Ron's work right there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it's interesting, this idea that mindfulness as a technique, because, you probably have seen those neuro headband devices. You put it around your head and you turn it on, and it's supposed to be able to get you into a meditative state, help with stress reduction and so forth. And, I think it's almost equivalent to that when you frame mindfulness as a technique. You might as well just wear one of those then.
Or you might as well just take an SSRI. Find the right pill or
medication,
right brainwave stimulator, and you can do without all that boring meditation.
Right.
We've seen some efforts in workshops in education. There's a controversy in terms of whether some of those people that Mark had observed are trying to smuggle in Buddhism. There's a kind of a stealth Buddhism.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the values, it's not just the technique. They would argue, well, we're bringing in compassion. We're teaching compassion, I always think that might have come from some of these folks' exposure or background in Buddhism. But it becomes this very generic term. It's very
self-compassion. Now it's self-compassion.
Well, certainly self-compassion, but also compassion for others in terms of empathy or getting along with people. So again, it slides into an instrumental usage. It's like, well, students need compassion so that they can cooperate and get along better, and so on. It becomes a valued skill that the mindfulness educators want to bring in, along with just as a technique of mindfulness. So there's a kind of a value there, but it's not really Buddhism, and it's not much of anything. It's just this generic term.
It also confuses compassion or empathy with a particular feeling state that you're trying to develop or cultivate.
Yes.
And I think that's a basic misunderstanding. Compassion or empathy really have more to do with a capacity to stay with and tolerate difference, and particularly differences that are upsetting and unpleasant.
Mm-hmm.
It's, are you able to stay with someone or with yourself when they are doing things that are upsetting to you? Or do you immediately need to calm them down, control them, or make them go away? Mm-hmm. And compassion is too often confused with sort of spraying a little mist of acceptance over everything, as if acceptance was a feeling. Acceptance is the capacity to leave everything alone, just as it is. Acceptance is not a smiley face sticker that you put on things, right? And I think that the whole cultivation of states takes people in exactly the wrong direction. One thing I've had to do with people to try to get them to understand this is I'll often give instruction to people in the Zendo to come in, sit down, but don't meditate.
Yeah.
I ask them, please just sit there without meditating for a really extended period of time. Leave your mind. I just want you to experience your mind as it is. Don't try to control your thoughts. Don't try to focus them on anything. See what your mind is like when you aren't trying to do something with it. And in a certain sense, this is almost an intolerable state for some people, that they become very upset of what comes to mind, of how restless they become, how bored they become, how worried they are. Even that they can worry they're not doing it right. It's interesting that one of the definitions, I think, of a technique is something that you can do well or badly.
Right. Do it right or wrong, too. Yeah.
Do it right or wrong. And the thing about real meditation is you can't do it right or wrong. It's the opening up of a space where right and wrong don't apply.
Yeah, and I think what happens is this meditation becomes almost self-centered. In the sense the self is always giving itself commentary, whether it's doing it right or wrong, and it's sort of the endless pursuit. And maybe that's a good time to talk about the endless pursuit of happiness, because the whole mindfulness phenomena is sort of embedded within the happiness industry, the discourse on happiness and well-being and success and so forth. So, can you say a little bit about the futility of this pursuit of happiness and how that relates to the idea of curative fantasies? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to a student the other day who, was talking about his anxieties about getting older, about being alone, and about how he periodically had, turned to alcohol or drugs to relieve all these feelings, and how he was hoping that meditation would enable him finally to be happy without drugs or alcohol. And I said, no, it's not going to be like that. Meditation is going to teach you to be unhappy. That's your problem. You don't know how to suffer intelligently. You see, people, you can't stay with a range of experience. He's always trying to fix it and make himself feel some way. And that's what's getting him in terrible trouble. He doesn't know how to just be lonely. He doesn't know how to be sad that he's getting older, or that he's, one thing after another. And what we're really in the business of doing is helping people stay with all the feelings they come to meditation to escape. And Joko used to say that it really takes people quite a few years to understand that that's what meditation or Zen really is about. And when they get it, most of them quit.
Right, because they're looking for happiness.
Because once they really see that's what it takes, they quit and they go across the street to somebody else who promises them, to fulfill that curative fantasy.
I think intelligent suffering should be the name if it hasn't already been of a book or a workshop or something. I think.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Your co-editor, Robert Rosenbaum, he has a really good quote on page 66 in the book. It says, "Mindfulness may give us the impression that if we are sufficiently conscious and attentive, we will be able to achieve what we want, whether it be cultivating kindness, making ourselves immune to stress, or succeeding in a business venture." So I think this seems to be just a core dilemma that people, I mean, not just in the mindfulness world, but in the Zen world.
Yes, it's everywhere people are going to come with a curative fantasy. I mean, it's part of human nature to say, if only I can get rid of this part of myself or get this other part under control, then I won't suffer. So whether you're coming to Zen or mindfulness or psychoanalysis, you've got some latent notion like that in the back of your mind. The question is whether the practice colludes with it or in some way exposes it and deconstructs it.
Yeah.
And then it seems like the practice itself could become part of the problem in a way.
Exactly. It joins the curative fantasy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what we've been seeing. David Lloyd talks about lack. That what you're pointing to. The
fundamental lack. Yeah, something's missing. Yes,
that's right.
Well, we can't resist, but you're from New York, and there is this New York Times journalist reporter who has this weekly column, and David Gelles, and I think it. Let me just read some of the titles of the articles that come out every week. How to be mindful at the gym. How to be mindful on the subway. How to be mindful if your flight is canceled. How to be mindful sitting in a dentist chair. How to be mindful while eating chocolates. Have a mindful Valentine's Day. How to be mindful while falling in love. How to be mindful while making coffee, ad nauseum. I mean, isn't this an example of how the practice becomes some sort of moral imperative or some sort of obsession that is kind of counter to the whole idea of liberation?
Well, it's the whole thing. What does he think you're doing by being mindful in those settings as opposed to just living your life? If you're in the dentist chair, just be scared, just be pain.
Well, he might argue that he's trying, like Buddhism, he's trying to reduce suffering. I think he might.
Well, it's really not.
Yeah.
I think really you probably should just stick with the first noble truth: life is suffering, and stop there. And be more honest.
We seem like we want to skip that one really quick.
Yeah, we want what follows it to negate it. When we think of a cause and end of suffering, I think we misunderstand what that's going to entail. Mm-hmm. The original version of when you ain't got nothing, you got nothing to lose, gets rid of suffering by getting rid of all your sense of attachment and security. That's a strange way around, and most people would find that solution actually more painful than the thing that they're said they're suffering from.
Yeah, or the thought of it. Yeah,
the thought of it. Yeah, I think that it's a problem when you turn mindfulness into a technique to handle every little situation in your life. It's fine to say, pay attention to each thing that's happening during the day, because this is your life. Your life is riding the subway. Your life is going to the dentist. It's not an interruption of your life, and it's not just on your way to when life is going to start when you're done with this stuff. This really is your life, so be present to it. But it's not in order to make anything else happen. It's just who and what you already are.
Yeah, that's a good point. One more New York example. You make the point in your book that one of the things that seems to be missing in the mindfulness movement is the notion of Sangha. And I know from being a member of various Buddhist centers and so forth that it's really more, as you put it, the commitment to each other, not just to your own mindfulness or meditation practice. You see that as something that's lacking in the workshop approach, for example.
Yeah, in workshops, you not only don't have a community, you don't have an ongoing long-term relationship with a teacher. Teachers are fungible in that system, and you go through a smorgasbord of as many different teachers as possible, rather than making a real lifelong commitment to a particular person and working out your issues in the context of that relationship. The notion of Sangha is to remind you that meditation is not something that's going on inside your head, sitting on a cushion.
Mm-hmm. Right, not a privatized spirituality.
Not a private internal experience, right? That it is something that you're sharing and participating in together, and in many ways only manifests in interaction. It's a demonstration of the fact that the self is not inside, that the self is actually a relational phenomenon, right? It's emergent from interaction.
You definitely see that within the Zen tradition with the teacher-student dialogues, koans, and so forth.
That's right. And in terms of the community, we realize that we are both enormously dependent on one another, because the fact is most of us are not going to sit facing a wall for 8 hours unless there's a considerable amount of structure and peer pressure.
Right.
And that we have to rub up against other people's personalities as a way to come to terms with our own attachments and likes and dislikes. That all of those things are going to manifest themselves only in relationship. I think that one of the fantasies of meditation practice, one of the curative fantasies, is a fantasy of autonomy, of independence and self-sufficiency. And people are really the greatest source of our suffering, other people.
That's what Sartre's, right?
Right? I mean, the idea that we need them, we care about them, we want them to care about us, right? Yeah. So what is the solution to that? One parody of meditation is to say, I will have no attachments, no dependencies, no need for other people. You hear a lot about compassion in Buddhism, but it's always one-directional. It's always about how you have to be compassionate to others. There is almost no mention of being on the receiving end of compassion and needing love.
Right.
And I found that even in Joko Beck, it was a very large lacuna in her teaching. She herself, because she was betrayed by her teacher, Maizumi, had a strong pull to independence and not relying on anybody. And my own version of her dictum of learning to suffer intelligently is that we have to learn to be dependent intelligently. Mm-hmm. That we're not in this practice in order to escape our need for other people or not to be vulnerable to other people, but to actually be open to our own vulnerability and our own dependency. Mm-hmm. Meditation ought to allow us to stay in that vulnerable state, not promise to help us escape it.
Yeah, that's I think the notion of a Sangha, as you've been explaining, is very important. It's definitely one of the three, part of the triple gems. That really is quite a contrast to this commodified version of mindfulness where, for example, right in, I think it's in the West Village there in Manhattan, there's a place called Mindful, MNDFL. It's a boutique drop-in studio where you can reserve your cushion online ahead of time.
Nice.
And you could sit there. Pay a
take
fee.
Credit cards, sure.
Yeah, pay a fee. Yeah, take credit cards, and then go your merry way. So
they've opened up a few branches. It's become quite popular.
Well, look, more power to them. Let people do that and exhaust whatever that offers. But I try to keep alive the idea that there's a real alternative to that, and that Zen practice is something qualitatively distinctly different from that, and that that option has to be kept alive.
And your point about that the Zen practice, Buddhist practice, is not a means to escape others or dependency. Is this where you think that Buddhism and Zen needs the West in terms of psychoanalysis to fill in these gaps and vice versa?
Yes, I think that traditional Zen is certainly vulnerable to being co-opted in people's curative fantasies. I mean, when I first started with Fado Roshi, it was an elitist, macho kind of program that completely valorized strength, pushed away weakness, and the result is this great psychological shadow side of sexuality and vulnerability and dependency on the great man. You know, all this just was never acknowledged or worked through. And Zen needs, Western psychology as much as we need Zen.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're getting up to the hour. Maybe we will wrap up the interview here. It's been a pleasure interviewing. We covered so much ground, and there's so much more we could talk about. Yes. But we want to thank you so much for joining the Mindful Cranks today.
Oh, thank you.
So take care, and we'll see you down the road.
Thank you.
We've been listening to Barry Magid, MD, who is a psychoanalyst in private practice in New York City. He received his Dharma Transmission from Charlotte Joko Beck in 1998 and has been teaching Zen at the Ordinary Mind Zendo for the past 20 years. In addition to co-editing What's Wrong with Mindfulness and What's Not with Bob Rosenbaum, he is the author of 3 books integrating Zen and psychoanalytic theory and practice, including Ordinary Mind, Ending the Pursuit of Happiness, and Nothing is Hidden, all published by Wisdom Publications. Stay tuned for the next episode on the Mindful Cranks. You can check out our website, mindfulcranks.com. Thank you for listening.